Okay, today we're going to do an overview of Congress. First, we're going to start with the basics that you are familiar with. The legislative branch is made up of Congress, whose primary role is making law. However, as we'll see, Congress can do more than just legislate, make laws. As you recall from last unit, the laws that Congress passes apply to the country as a whole. In other words, Congress makes federal law that all states must follow. Now, each state also has its own state legislature, which makes laws applicable to that state only. Now, our Congress, our U.S. Congress, is a bicameral legislature. And a bicameral legislature, this goes in your notes, is a legislature made up of two houses or chambers, cameral for chambers. These two chambers are called the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, why do we have a bicameral legislature? Several reasons. One is historical or traditional. Our framers, most of them came from Britain, or their fathers or grandfathers had come from Britain, and so they were accustomed to a bicameral legislature, which Britain has and did at that time. Also, there's a practical reason. It emerged as a part of the Great Compromise when the framers, meaning the people building the structure of what became our government, there was an argument between the small states and the larger states in terms of them worrying about the fairness of the system. So to make the small states happy, the Senate was created, in which every single state is represented equally. Each state gets two representatives. That made the small states happy, so they felt like they wouldn't be completely bullied by the larger states. But the larger states were unhappy because they had much more population, and they thought that that meant that they should have much more say. And in the U.S. House of Representatives, that's how it works. In fact, California has the largest population, so California has the largest say in the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives made the larger states happy. And then there's the theoretical reason. Framers wanted a more removed elite body, which turned out to be the Senate, as well as a more populist, a radical body, which turned out to be the House, and for them to act as a check on each other. So, congressional terms. Each term of Congress lasts 2 years. Terms begin each January of every odd-numbered year. At the end of every 2 years, Congress adjourns, or ends, or breaks off, and a new term starts. Congress also takes periodic vacations, which are called recesses. Make sure you get all of this vocabulary into your notes. Now, I want you to Google something, and this also goes in your notes. Which session of Congress are we currently in? Okay, so some details about the House of Representatives. There are 435 members, and the reps, how many reps do each state get? That's based on population. Each state gets at least one representative. Larger states get more. California has 53 representatives, the most, because we have the largest population. Now that changes every 10 years. A census is conducted every 10 years where population of each state is counted, and if the population of one state goes down and the population of another state significantly goes up, that state where the population goes up could get a new representative to represent them in Congress, in the House of Representatives, and then the state that lost population could lose a seat in the House of Representatives as a result of population shifts. Length of term, 2 years. Each representative is elected by a district, not the whole state. And the House of Representatives tends to be known to be more radical, and they also tend to be more responsive to changes in public opinion. The representative only has 2 years to work before they have to run for a new election, so they really have to listen to the voters that they have to answer to, because their job is they're constantly having to run for their job, run for their position. So they tend to be very responsive. And special powers, they have the power of introducing revenue bills or tax bills. Those must originate in the House. As you recall, we covered this before. They must be at least 25 years old, and they must be a citizen for at least 7 years in order to qualify to represent in the House of Representatives. And they must live in their state, though they don't necessarily have to live in the district that votes for them. The Senate, there are 100 members in the Senate. States are represented equally, regardless of size. All states get 2 senators each. Each senator gets 6-year terms. So, in fact, senators serve longer than presidents do. And 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. And any voter in a particular state can vote for their senators. And generally the Senate is considered to be more reserved, less likely to be radical in their decision making, and they tend to be less likely to answer to the whims of their peculiar local interests. And the Senate, of course, has a tremendous amount of special powers, such as confirming presidential nominations and confirming Supreme Court nominations and ratifying treaties. Senators have to be at least 30 years old, and they must have been a citizen in the United States for 9 years, and they must be a resident of their state. Now, the powers of Congress. Congress has 2 types of power, legislative and non-legislative. Legislative powers, the powers related to their ability to make laws. So debating a bill, overriding a bill, those are legislative powers. Some of their non-legislative powers, meaning the powers that they have that have nothing to do with writing law, these can be declaring war. Only Congress has the power to declare war. Confirming judges, impeaching officials such as presidents or federal judges, and investigating other branches. These are all non-legislative powers that the Constitution has given to Congress. Now, this is review. Checks on the executive branch. Overriding a president's veto requires 2/3 vote in both houses. Refusing to pass legislation the president wants. Refusing to ratify a president's treaty, of course that's the Senate only. Refusing to confirm a president's appointment, Senate only. Impeaching the president. Conducting investigations of the bureaucracy or the president. Refusing to fund programs, policies, or agencies. This is the power of the purse. And their checks on the judicial branch include refusing to confirm a president's judicial nominee, amending the Constitution. Supreme Court can't declare something unconstitutional if it's in the Constitution. So if they amend the Constitution, this is something the Supreme Court can't override. Refuse to write legislation the Supreme Court wants. These are checks on the judicial branch. Okay, now, here is a concept that is a fairly simple concept, but I've noticed that students often never quite understand. We're going to try and figure out the difference between a voter and a constituent. A voter is a person who votes or has the right to vote in an election. So, imagine that every person in this map represents a legal voter in the United States. Now, which of these American voters has the right to vote for president in the upcoming election? Which of these American voters has the right to vote for California's U.S. Senate seat in the upcoming election? Now, this term constituent is somewhat being a voting member of a community or organization and having the power to appoint or elect. So, which of these American voters is not a constituent of our current U.S. senators? Which of these American voters is not a constituent of California's 4th Congressional District? So the U.S. Senate is supposed to solve whose problems? The U.S. House of Representatives is supposed to solve whose problems? Now imagine a law were proposed in Congress that, if passed, would benefit all Americans except Californians. If our congresspersons voted in favor of that bill, which would they accomplish? Help 300 million Americans and hurt 40 million Americans? Represent the needs of the majority of American voters? Represent the needs of their constituents? Which would they accomplish if they passed a bill proposed in Congress that would benefit all Americans except Californians? Now, which do you think would be the more moral, ethical action for our congresspersons? This really is debatable. Good arguments can be made for both sides. Which do you think would be most moral, ethical action for our congressperson? To represent the needs of their constituents, or for them to represent the needs of the majority of American voters? To vote for the bill or to vote against the bill? Which would be the most moral, ethical action for our congresspersons? Now, why does our representative, thinking of that previous example, does our representative have a conflict of interest when he or she serves the country in Washington, D.C.? Why do our senators have a conflict of interest when they serve the country in Washington, D.C.? Now, RJ's story. You're going to be reading RJ's story, and you're going to be discussing in your write-up of that story what current issue is RJ's bill trying to solve? Where did RJ get the idea for his bill? And what do you make of his idea? Do you think it's a good solution to the problem of addiction? Or are there other ways to solve this problem? Lastly,